Robert Hayes woke up like any other day, but today felt slightly different. The faint morning light slipped through the curtains, casting reflections on the luxurious items in his vast bedroom. The extravagant bed, which had perhaps hosted thousands of nights, offered Robert neither warmth nor peace. In the dimly lit room, only the steady ticking of the clock on the expensive oak table broke the silence, each tick a reminder of time passing, heedless of one's success or solitude. He was one of the most powerful men in the global real estate industry. His wealth reached billions of dollars, and his network spanned from the grand boardrooms of the largest corporations to the lavish halls of elite galas. He had built his career on bold leaps, crushing every rival without mercy or retreat. Everything served a single purpose: power. Today, as usual, Robert rose from a restless sleep, no dreams lingering in his mind. He stepped in the bathroom, turned on the powerful shower, and let the hot water cascade over his body. Yet the warmth couldn't thaw the coldness in his heart. The droplets fell, breaking into thin, fragile streams before vanishing, much like the emotions he had long forgotten. He was a man who couldn't afford to believe in his own weakness, constantly reminding himself that success left no room for vulnerability. After finishing his personal routine, he looked into the mirror once more. The man staring back was an image he had crafted throughout his life, a steadfast, powerful figure, surrounded by expensive suits, polished leather shoes, and a cold demeanor that commanded respect and caution from all who crossed his path. He smiled with satisfaction, as if questioning whether he was perfect enough. Robert's breakfast was lavish, but not for enjoyment. He cared little for the food, viewing it merely as a task to complete. The dishes, prepared by the help, were ones he never truly paid attention to, from golden toasted bread to a strong black coffee. He wasn't one to seek joy in bites of food or idle chatter. To him, everything was a transaction, a piece of the grand plan he had meticulously laid out. Robert's work system was a finely tuned machine, planned with precision and always in motion. His schedule was so perfect that not a single moment passed without purpose. Even as he sat in his expensive leather chair in the office, phone calls and emails poured in relentlessly, bringing tough decisions and major issues to resolve. People called him the conductor, a captain of a financial empire he had built from scratch. Every word he spoke carried weight, and every decision was a strategic move in the complex chess game of the financial world. When his luxurious silver Mercedes S-Class rolled out of his massive villa, Robert never looked back. Perched atop a hill with a panoramic view of the city, the villa's beauty meant nothing to him. He gazed out the car window, his eyes skimming over the bustling streets without lingering. To him, nothing mattered except the goal ahead. The car swiftly delivered him to the company's main office building, where he would spend most of his day. The glass doors reflected sunlight and beams of brilliance, and as he entered, people rose to greet him like a king. No one in the real estate world didn't know Robert Hayes. Those who worked with him understood that only the truly exceptional could stand by his side. Robert's workday was far from easy. He dove into a series of meetings, negotiated major contracts, and signed decisions that shifted market dynamics. But he never felt tired. Power had become part of his very being. He relished it, the feeling of being admired, feared, and depended upon. Every negotiation was a battle of wits, and Robert never lost. Yet, amid that tense atmosphere, as financial heights, power, and fame continued to pile up, Robert couldn't deny the loneliness in his soul. Despite commanding a mighty empire, despite the thousands who revered him and the billions in his accounts, he felt an indescribable emptiness. It was something he'd never had time to dwell on. Sitting in his office with stacks of files towering like mountains, gazing out at the skyscrapers through the window, he wondered, what does all this mean? He didn't dare answer that question, knowing the response would force him to face a truth he wasn't ready to acknowledge. In his world of power, he was a solitary figure, chasing external triumphs while neglecting the core values within. But today, he couldn't shake a strange unease, as if something in his life was about to change, something beyond his control, despite his mastery over everything in his grasp. Perhaps things wouldn't unfold as he expected. But until then, Robert's life marched on. One more day, one more decision, one more step on the path to glory he had forged for himself. On a morning like any other, as Robert Hayes drove his Mercedes S-Class along the long road from his villa to the company headquarters, he had no idea that an event capable of altering his life awaited him ahead. The summer sunlight poured over the city, casting a thin layer of golden dust across every corner. But to Robert, such things failed to capture his attention. For him, everything could be measured in numbers, and he had once felt as though he could control it all, until that moment. As usual, his car sped through the pristine streets, past skyscrapers with gleaming glass facades reflecting the lazy clouds drifting across the blue sky. Everything seemed peaceful, yet an inexplicable unease crept into his mind. It was a vague discomfort, as if something was about to happen, something unplanned, beyond calculation. That restlessness seemed to follow him the entire way, and before he realized it, his car had rolled into an area he rarely passed through, an impoverished slum on the city's edge. This was a place of nothing but dark alleys, ramshackle houses, and people living in poverty. It was a world Robert had always ignored, one he had never wanted to be involved with. But today, when his Mercedes came to an abrupt halt due to an unforeseen problem, he realized his calm had been shattered. His tire had gone flat. That nagging unease turned into frustration. He pressed hard on the accelerator, trying to push the car forward, but it was no use. He picked up his phone, only to discover there was no signal and no way to call for roadside assistance. With no other options, he was forced to stop, pulling the car to the roadside to deal with the issue himself. Fatigue began to pile up with each passing moment. He sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, eyes squinting at the deserted road. All he could see were dilapidated houses perched precariously, as if stubbornly resisting the hardships life had thrown at them. Suddenly, a small figure emerged from one of those homes. A boy, about 14 years old, with black hair and a youthful face, but eyes that held a striking resolve. He wore a faded t-shirt, worn-out sneakers, and his hands bore calluses and cracks. Unlike the children Robert typically encountered, this boy seemed special. He approached, his gaze fixed on the car. Without needing to be asked, the boy spoke, his voice steady and free of hesitation. "Something wrong with the car, sir?" Robert looked up, meeting the boy standing before him. For a moment, he felt a flicker of confusion. This boy showed no fear or hint of timidity when facing a successful man like him. Robert merely nodded, trying to maintain his composure. "Yes, my car has a flat tire. I can't call for help from here," Robert replied, his voice tinged with tension but still striving for politeness. The boy didn't seem surprised. Instead, he smiled and stepped forward, crouching beside the tire and rolling up his pant leg. "I can help you," he said, his eyes bright. "Do you have a spare tire?" Facing this boy, who displayed no worry or fear in this situation, Robert sensed something profoundly different. It was as if this child harbored no dread of the world around him, no insecurity like Robert felt. Though puzzled, Robert pointed to the trunk where the spare tire was stored. The boy swiftly opened it, retrieving the tools with ease. Each movement was quick and confident, his hands working as if this were a daily task, devoid of hesitation or difficulty. Robert stood there, watching the boy with a strange curiosity. To him, this was an unusual situation. This child was unlike anyone he had met in his elite world. There was no reluctance, no expectation of reward. Robert was accustomed to transactions, to exchanges with clear value. Every act of help came with a price. But here, before him, this boy was doing the opposite, helping without asking for anything in return. Once the tire was replaced, the boy stood up, wiping his hands on his tattered jeans and offering Robert a faint smile. All done. You can go now. Robert froze for a moment. He pulled a few bills from his wallet and held them out, hesitating as he said, "Thank you. This is a little something for your help." But the boy just looked at him, shaking his head gently. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need anything. I just did it because it needed to be done." A sudden wave of emotion washed over Robert. He felt an indescribable stir, a strange tremor in his heart. This boy wasn't just different in circumstance. He was different in how he viewed life. Giving without expecting, helping unconditionally. These were things Robert had long forgotten. The boy turned and walked back toward the alley, leaving Robert standing there, still clutching the money he hadn't put away. He watched the small figure retreat, wondering to himself if he had ever lived a life like that. Unconcerned with material things, unbothered by gain, simply existing for small, honest moments. And when the boy disappeared around the corner, Robert felt a strange hollowness. He couldn't explain it, but something had shifted within him in that instant. A feeling he had never known before. The sensation of a powerful man who was also missing something vital in his life. He started the car, and as he drove, thoughts of the boy lingered in his mind. It seemed this encounter was no mere coincidence. The next day, Robert Hayes couldn't shake the thoughts of the boy he had met the day before. Those images kept swirling in his mind. A black boy with bright eyes, calloused hands, and tattered shoes, yet working with an extraordinary confidence. It wasn't the kind of confidence Robert saw in successful men, those who rose through cunning and strategy, but a raw, primal confidence born of patience and sincerity. Everything seemed to return to normal after Robert's car was fixed. He went on with his workday, filled with back-to-back meetings and tense financial decisions. But something in his soul felt absent. He couldn't deny that since meeting the boy, a strange sensation had taken hold of him, a feeling he had never experienced before, despite having conquered the business world. He had become a man of reason, no longer believing in spontaneity or emotions that could shake the fortress he had so carefully built. But yesterday, watching the boy change his tire without a single question or demand, he realized he might have overlooked a vital part of life. Robert couldn't resist returning to the slum today. An inexplicable, powerful urge compelled him to act. He drove slowly through the familiar streets, but this time he didn't feel the usual suffocation of bustling neighborhoods. Instead, there was a strange emptiness. Gone was the rush of major deals, the pride of stepping onto red carpets. Only a void and a growing sense of doubt enveloped his mind. He decided to stop at a small coffee shop in the area, a place frequented by the slum's residents. The rundown coffee shop was unlike the places Robert typically visited. The painted tables and chairs were faded, the fluorescent lights flickered, and the air was hazy with cigarette smoke. The rich aroma of coffee mingled with the space, making Robert feel as though he had stepped into another world. He entered, not with any clear purpose, but simply to learn about this place and the people who lived here, people he had ignored for far too long. As he stepped inside, a middle-aged woman behind the counter greeted him with a warm smile. She wore an old uniform, her hands marked with calluses, much like those who worked in this slum. Robert could sense her gaze, not one of curiosity or wariness, but a gentle, confident look that didn't seek to overpower. He approached the counter and asked, hesitating slightly, "I'm looking for a boy, about 14 years old. His name is Jacob. Perhaps you know him." The woman studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether to respond. After a few seconds, she smiled and said, "Ah, Jacob, that kind boy, I know him. He's always helping people around here. His mother lives nearby in a small house. He doesn't need thanks, but he's always ready to lend a hand when he can." Robert was taken aback. In the worlds he had lived in, people only helped when there was a clear motive, some benefit to gain. But Jacob was different. He realized this boy might not just be ordinary. There was something special about him that Robert had never encountered. He asked for directions to Jacob's house and continued on his way. The streets grew quieter, lined with crumbling houses, and the air felt heavier than ever. Robert parked in front of a simple home, unremarkable except for its worn, weathered exterior. He paused, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. The door opened before he could knock. A woman stood there, her face kind but tinged with fatigue. This was Mary, Jacob's mother, whom he had heard so much about from the woman at the coffee shop. Mary invited him inside. The house was small but clean and tidy, furnished with modest items that seemed carefully tended to. "Thank you for welcoming me," Robert said, settling into a dark green upholstered chair in the living room. "I'm Robert Hayes. I met Jacob yesterday, and I wanted to thank him for helping me with my tire." Mary smiled, her eyes reflecting a deep understanding. "He doesn't need thanks, Mr. Hayes. He does these things out of kindness. He's been helping others like that since he was little." Robert felt something unfamiliar in her words. He couldn't fathom someone living so naturally, without calculation, simply to help others. It stirred a humility in him he had never known before. "Where is he?" Robert asked. Mary pointed toward the backyard. "He's out back, fixing the fence. He loves working, especially on things that can help people." Robert walked outside and saw Jacob bent over, holding a small hammer, repairing a broken section of the fence. Hearing footsteps, Jacob looked up and recognized him. "Mr. Hayes, you're back?" Jacob asked, his voice devoid of surprise. Robert smiled, a touch awkwardly. "I wanted to thank you again, but this time it's not just thanks. I want to learn more about you, about how you see life." Jacob didn't reply immediately. He stayed silent for a moment before standing up. "I don't do anything special, Mr. Hayes. I just think that if you can help someone, you should. No need for thanks." A strange wave surged within Robert. He looked into Jacob's clear eyes and saw a faith in life he had never possessed. In that moment, he realized the boy's help wasn't just about the tire yesterday. It was a lesson in compassion and simplicity, things he had overlooked throughout his life. Though he didn't say it aloud, deep down, Robert knew this was the start of a unique friendship. A bond not built on money or power, but on understanding and kindness. From that day, their relationship began, starting with brief conversations, growing into moments when Robert sought Jacob's honest advice or a bit of peace amid a chaotic, pressured world. This friendship, though its future was uncertain, had begun simply yet profoundly. In the days that followed, though he couldn't fully explain the emotions Jacob had stirred within him, Robert couldn't escape the strange compulsion to see the boy again. There was something about Jacob, his bright eyes and undeniable sincerity, that made Robert question whether he had been wrong to live his entire life chasing values built on money and power. He couldn't ignore what the boy had brought into his life. Not just help in a moment of need, but something deeper, a lesson in kindness and selflessness he had never considered in all his years. Each time he stepped into his office, the stacks of files, incessant phone calls, and contracts awaiting his signature no longer sparked excitement. The things he had honed his entire life seemed trivial, faded. The numbers and deals he had once prided himself on were no longer the only things he wanted to possess. A quiet undercurrent of unease and restlessness pulled at him, dragging a whirlwind of thoughts through his mind. Have I been doing the right thing? Robert asked himself as he gazed into the mirror in his room, where the reflection showed a powerful, successful man, yet one plagued by unease. He wondered if the life he was living was truly the path he wanted, or merely an endless game he had drawn up for himself. This feeling, though nameless, was so potent it left him standing at a crossroads, unable to see the way forward. Day after day, Robert carried on with his work, but each encounter with Jacob or the people of the slum sharpened the contrast between the world he inhabited and the lives lived there. Jacob hadn't just helped him change a tire. He was a mirror reflecting a simple, honest existence Robert had never truly seen. That boy, with his optimistic, shining eyes, cared nothing for money or societal recognition. All Jacob wanted was to help those around him, with no motive beyond pure sincerity. One evening, after a long day at the company, Robert could no longer avoid his thoughts of Jacob. He drove to the slum without a clear purpose, simply wanting to see the boy again. He parked by the roadside, gazing at the small, run-down houses teeming with life. Children played in the streets, mothers bustled with household chores, and old men sat on rocking chairs, all painting a vivid picture Robert had never noticed in all his years. He walked through the alleys, each step feeling like a break from the luxurious, extravagant shell of his life. When he reached Jacob's house, he paused, struck by a sense of unfamiliarity, as if stepping into a world he didn't belong to. He wasn't sure if he should knock, uncertain how his words might be received. He stood there, watching the dim light spilling from the window, hearing the faint sound of laughter from within. In that moment, hesitation swelled within him. Robert lingered for a long while before finally deciding to knock. Mary, Jacob's mother, opened the door. She greeted him with a gentle smile, showing no trace of surprise, as if she had known he would return. Mary invited him inside, and just as before, he felt an odd warmth in this small home, despite its lack of the material comforts he was accustomed to. That sensation, though vague, was clear and full, highlighting a stark difference from his own life. Jacob sat in a corner of the room, his eyes fixed on an old book. He looked up as Robert entered, with no hint of surprise in his gaze. Perhaps the boy had already sensed that Robert wasn't easily swayed by simple things. Yet he had no intention of trying to change this man. "I just wanted to thank you again," Robert began, his voice tinged with hesitation, "for your help the other day. But it's more than that. I think there are some things I'd like to learn from you." Jacob didn't respond right away. He sat in silence for a moment, his bright eyes never leaving Robert. That gaze, a child's look, unswayed by vanity, untouched by the illusions of power or wealth, made Robert feel exposed. For the first time, he felt like a stranger in the very world he had created. "You've helped me see the world differently," Jacob finally said, his voice calm. "But I don't need your thanks. I do what feels right. You might not understand, but I don't need anything from you." Robert fell silent, a bittersweet pang rising in his chest. He had spent his life building what people called success, things measurable only by money and power. Yet here, before him, was a black boy with nothing but sincerity, making everything he had seen meaningless. He had believed power could control all, but to Jacob, those things were alien and unnecessary. Stepping into Jacob's life was like facing himself, the battles he had won, the successful deals he had sealed, None of them could bring him the joy this simple boy could offer. He realized it was he who was lacking simplicity, compassion, the sincerity this child possessed. The closer he got to Jacob, the more he felt the divide between two worlds, one of powerful people and one of those who lived by kindness and sharing. The simple conversations, wordless glances, and gentle smiles from Jacob haunted him. Bit by bit, Robert's life was cast in a new light, one he had never noticed before. Though he didn't voice it, deep in his soul, he knew this was the moment to confront himself and the choices he had made throughout his life. This visit, though just a brief stop at Jacob's home, became a pivotal turning point in Robert Hayes' life. This black boy hadn't just fixed his tire. He had opened a door for Robert to explore himself, to recognize that some values in life couldn't be measured by money or power. One day, as Robert stepped into the towering building housing his company's headquarters, that gentle feeling returned. An inexplicable restlessness and discomfort gnawed at him, as though a storm lurked somewhere nearby, unseen but keenly felt. He entered his office, reviewing financial reports with his usual serious focus. But the numbers and new deals couldn't hold his attention. His thoughts drifted to Jacob, to his mother, to their simple yet emotionally rich life. The last encounter in the slum lingered in his mind like an unanswered question, hovering as a persistent doubt. Even so, in the power-laden, stifling world of financial transactions, his confusion had no place. He couldn't allow himself to be distracted by thoughts of the slum's residents. He needed to stand firm, keep working, and push through. But today was different. As soon as the meeting ended and Robert returned to his office, an unexpected call came through. On the other end, his secretary's voice unsettled him. "Mr. Hayes, I need to inform you of an urgent matter. There's been a serious incident in Jacob's family's area." Her words made Robert's legs falter. He didn't understand why an odd anxiety gripped him, but something inside wouldn't let him ignore it. He rushed out, with no time to ask for more details, driven by the sole certainty that he had to get there immediately. When he arrived at the slum, what he saw defied belief. A crowd had gathered in front of Jacob's house, the air so thick with tension it felt like a tidal wave crashing over him. Loud voices, shouts, and arguments heightened the strain. Familiar faces, people from the neighborhood, stood there, their eyes brimming with judgment and hatred. "What's going on?" Robert yelled at a man nearby. The man eyed Robert with suspicion. "You don't know? Jacob's family is being driven out of this area. Damn it, we don't want a black kid like him living here anymore." Those words struck Robert like a slap. He couldn't believe what he'd heard. Cruel words, and the flames of hatred and racism flared up in this very neighborhood he had thought was relatively peaceful. It felt as if the ground beneath him crumbled. He saw Jacob standing there, his face helpless and pained, silent amidst the crowd, utterly alone. Jacob's mother, Mary, tried to shield her son, but her resistance was futile against the crowd's threats. "He's got to go. Trash like him, a black kid, has no right to live here. This is a white area, not a place for his kind." A voice from the crowd rang out, igniting even harsher jeers. Anger surged within Robert. He stepped forward, unable to contain his outrage. "What's happening here? Why are you acting like this? This boy hasn't done anything wrong. Why are you driving him out?" A middle-aged man, the apparent leader of the group, turned to face Robert with a challenging glare. "You're not from this area, so you don't get a say. He's black, and we don't want him here. That's why you should stay out of our business." The man's words hit Robert like a blow. He couldn't fathom that, in the society he lived in, there were still people like this, caught in the whirlpool of racism, blind to the cruelty in their own words. Robert's emotions at that moment were beyond words. He wasn't an impatient man, but everything he had upheld his whole life seemed to collapse before his eyes. Power, money, all the things he deemed important meant nothing now. He saw Jacob, a black boy who had done no wrong, being expelled from the community solely for his skin color. Helplessness and fury welled up inside him. Robert moved forward, stopping in front of the crowd's leader. He locked eyes with the man, but said nothing. For the first time in his life, Robert couldn't find sharp words or clever arguments to counter. He simply stood there, hollow, as if lost in a world he had never known. Seeing Robert's silence, the man smirked and turned away, leading the others with him. The crowd dispersed slowly, leaving Jacob and Mary standing alone and wounded. A shiver ran down Robert's spine. He turned to look at Jacob, unable to shake a sense of shame. He wanted to do something, but he didn't know where to begin. Jacob stood there, wordless, his eyes tinged with sadness yet holding a strange strength. He looked at Robert as if waiting for something. "It's okay, Mr. Hayes," Jacob said, his voice low and steady. "Everything passes. We're used to this." Jacob's words jolted Robert. This boy, cast out, insulted, and rejected, could stand firm and say such things. Robert felt like a weakling in the face of the boy's strength and resilience. In that moment, Robert understood that the change he sought wasn't just within himself. It came from people like Jacob, those who endured and fought to exist, armed with nothing but love and patience. He couldn't keep standing on the sidelines. He had to act. And though the world held immense challenges, he knew today that he had to stand up for what was right. That day, it wasn't just Jacob who learned a profound lesson about resilience and the power of justice. Robert did too. The boy hadn't only shown him the truth about society. He had taught him that sometimes change doesn't come from grand victories, but from small, steady steps in life. That afternoon, as the sky began to turn a golden orange, Robert Hayes sat in his office, staring at the computer screen, though his eyes saw nothing. The numbers on the display no longer held any allure for him. Meetings, major deals, decisions about multi-million-dollar real estate projects, all seemed like trivialities, incapable of soothing the unease in his heart. Throughout that day, his mind kept returning to images of Jacob and his mother, Mary. The shouts from the crowd, the cruel words he had heard about racial discrimination, those scenes spun relentlessly in his thoughts. He thought of that black boy with shining eyes, standing firm and silent amidst a world of hatred and injustice. That boy needed nothing from him, only a shred of fairness in a society riddled with barriers. Robert could hardly breathe as he dwelled on it. A painful, furious ache rose within him. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He couldn't stand by and watch such injustice persist. What he had witnessed that day couldn't fade away. The value Jacob brought him wasn't just aid in a fleeting moment. It was a lesson in patience, strength, and defiance in the face of adversity. He asked himself, if this boy could confront hatred and still stand tall, could he really remain a bystander in this fight forever? He glanced at the phone on his desk, his hand clutching the pen used to sign contracts. But it felt worthless now. Each signature on those papers was merely a transaction of soulless numbers, contracts devoid of real meaning. He set the pen down, unease swelling in his chest. Jacob and his mother continued to live in the slum, enduring discrimination and unfairness every day. And he, a powerful man with the world in his grasp, could do nothing to change a society like this. He deserves a better life, Robert told himself. He couldn't sit idly by as things carried on this way. Jacob deserved a chance to live in an environment free from discrimination. And he, though an outsider, could do something about it. The unease was no longer vague. It was a fierce, undeniable urge, a restlessness he couldn't dismiss. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out. The city, with its dazzling lights, kept moving forward. Everything flowed on, but in some hidden corner, Jacob and others like him still faced a world teeming with undercurrents of strife. Maybe it's time to act, Robert thought, his resolve stronger than ever. This decision didn't come in a moment of impulse. It was forged through every second of reflection, a choice he knew would change everything, not just for Jacob and his family, but for himself. The world of power he had once seen as truth no longer sufficed to give him faith in life. He needed to do something greater. The next day, Robert didn't head to the office as usual. He went out, driving his Mercedes S-Class through familiar streets, but this time it was different. Today, he went straight to the slum. It was a bold, challenging decision for a man like him. For the first time, he didn't feel the stifling weight of affluent streets or the bustle of towering buildings. Only a small neighborhood filled with people struggling to survive. He stopped in front of Jacob's house. There was no lavish decoration, just a plain, dilapidated home. But to Robert, it was a place of life, a vessel for values he had once overlooked. He stepped out of the car and entered. Mary sat at the dining table, preparing dinner. The soft yellow light in the small house illuminated her face, creating an oddly peaceful atmosphere. Jacob sat nearby, reading a book. He looked up as Robert walked in. "Mr. Hayes, why are you here?" Jacob asked, his voice gentle but tinged with surprise. Robert smiled, though something different flickered in his eyes. "I came to talk to you. I think it's time I did something." Mary glanced up at him, her eyes filled with curiosity, yet a strange calm. She didn't ask much, only quietly invited him to sit. "I want to help you," Robert said, his voice resolute. "Not just with material things, but by changing your life, giving you opportunities. You deserve a better future." Jacob looked at him, his gaze hesitant. The boy didn't respond right away, as if pondering Robert's words. After a long pause, he spoke, his tone low and steady. "Do you really understand what I'm living through, Mr. Hayes? Do you know what it's like to face racism every day? Do you know what I've done to stand strong in this world?" Robert fell silent. He realized the boy's words weren't just a question. They were an indictment of a world he had never truly seen. He couldn't answer immediately. A sense of emptiness washed over him, and he began to understand that while he could alter circumstances, true change had to come from within, from a shift in how society viewed people like Jacob. "You're right," Robert finally said, his voice softer. "I can't fully grasp your life, but I want to do something to help. I want you to have a chance to change everything." Jacob didn't reply at once, simply gazing at him with contemplative eyes. At last, he nodded, as if recognizing something in the sincerity of Robert's words. "Thank you, but I'll walk my own path," Jacob said, his eyes brimming with determination. "I just want you to understand that, with or without help, I'll keep standing." Robert felt immense respect for this boy. Though he didn't need assistance, Jacob refused to back down, holding fast to his beliefs. And in that moment, Robert knew his decision wasn't wrong. This wasn't just about helping someone. It was a profound change within himself. He wasn't only doing the right thing for another person, but for the values he had once ignored. Robert Hayes woke up one morning, but it wasn't like other mornings. The light streamed into the room through the window. It no longer felt like the start of a new day filled with plans and ambitions. He sat up, gazing out at the sprawling city, but this time the feeling in his heart wasn't satisfaction with what he had achieved. Something deep within him had shifted. Though he couldn't name it precisely, it was too vivid to ignore. Since his encounter with Jacob and the boy's family, Robert's thoughts had changed irrevocably. He had spent his life adhering to standards he set for himself. Money, power, and success. These were the forces that had driven his existence, convincing him that possessing them meant having everything. But through just a few interactions with Jacob, a black boy from the impoverished slum, he began to realize that there were things in life more vital than all he had pursued. That day, Robert didn't rush as he usually did. He still went to work, but not with the hurried, ambitious mindset of before. Within him, thoughts of racial discrimination and the injustices Jacob and his family endured swirled incessantly. He reflected on Jacob's words, on how the boy had overcome countless hardships without any help. That boy hadn't just helped him change a tire. He had shown Robert that life couldn't always be measured by numbers or victories in the business arena. The profound values Jacob embodied weren't things money or power could buy. So, as he sat in his office, Robert stared at the numbers on the screen but couldn't focus. The phone calls and important meetings faded into insignificance. He recalled the day he stood amid the crowd outside the slum, witnessing how Jacob and his mother were treated. The mob had cursed them, insulted them, all because of their skin color. In that moment, Robert realized that everything he had once deemed right might be wrong. He asked himself, if he didn't stand up, who would? In the days that followed, Robert couldn't turn a blind eye. He felt as though he stood at a crossroads. One part of him longing to return to the familiar world of deals and business agreements, the things he had always taken pride in. But another part yearned for change, not just to help a poor boy, but to transform himself and his perspective on life. He knew he couldn't keep living in the safety and comfort of the values he had built. He wanted to do something greater, something that could shift this world, even just a little. That day, he resolved to meet Jacob and Mary, not merely to thank them, but to share what he had felt since meeting them. He drove to the slum, but this time it was different. He felt no hesitation or prejudice. He no longer saw the area as a forgotten corner of society, but as a place alive with people and stories that deserved to be heard and understood. When he arrived at Jacob's house, the boy and his mother were eating dinner. Mary smiled as she saw him, showing no surprise. Perhaps she had anticipated this day. Jacob looked up, his eyes as bright as they were the first time Robert met him. But now there was something in that gaze that made Robert feel he needed to change from within. I've thought a lot about what I've seen and felt, Robert said, his voice low and resolute. You've taught me so much. You're not just someone who helped me with a tire. You've changed how I see life. Jacob said nothing, simply listening. He showed no surprise or pride. The boy was surely used to gratitude, but this time, Robert didn't just want to thank him. He wanted to share the transformation in his heart. We all live in a world where money and power are valued above all else. But I've realized there are other things that matter more. I've spent too long in the shadow of outward success, forgetting that real change comes from doing what's right, from standing against injustice. Robert continued, his eyes filled with determination. And I want to help you. Not just to escape discrimination, but to give you a chance at a life you deserve. Mary looked at Robert, her eyes full of respect. Jacob, though silent, seemed to acknowledge his words with that quiet presence. Robert knew he was in the right place. But it wasn't just about aiding Jacob's family. It was about changing himself, finding a new path to live by. Robert was no longer a man defined solely by power and wealth. He began acting on the values he had newly discovered: fairness, compassion, and resilience. He helped Jacob's family not just with money, but by creating opportunities for Jacob to study, to break free from poverty and prejudice. He sought ways to support other families in the slum, establishing a program to provide education and jobs for those in need. As time passed, Robert saw change not only in Jacob's family but in himself. He no longer felt the pressure of numbers or the need to uphold the reputation and power he had built. Instead, he found a new joy in helping others, a joy he had never known before. Each time he saw Jacob succeed, each time he saw Mary smile with happiness because her family's life had improved, Robert felt he had done something meaningful. This change in Robert wasn't easy. He faced difficulties and opposition from those around him. But in those struggles, he found true fulfillment. He knew he had done right, not just because of what Jacob had brought into his life, but because he himself had transformed. Values he couldn't see before now became the light guiding him forward. Everything had gradually shifted since Robert decided to stand against the injustices he had ignored for too long. He had grown closer to Jacob, helped the boy's family, and, most importantly, transformed himself. But like waves that cannot be stilled in an open sea, this change didn't come easily. The world Robert had built over his lifetime, a world founded on power and money, began to rise up against him. One day, as he sat in his office, the phone rang. On the other end was his secretary's voice, but this time it wasn't about meetings or contracts. "Mr. Hayes, I just received a call from a group of investors. They want to meet with you immediately. They have a serious issue they need to discuss." Robert sensed the tension in her tone. He didn't need to hear more to guess what awaited him. The unease he had felt recently surged within him again. He knew the time had come to face those who didn't want him to change, those who wouldn't let him dismantle the system they had upheld for so long. When the meeting took place, Robert stepped into the large conference room where the most powerful men in the real estate industry awaited. Each was a prominent figure, tied to lucrative contracts and major deals. But the atmosphere was starkly different. No one smiled or offered a handshake. Only cold, furious stares met Robert. He could feel the tension thick in the air. "Robert, we can't sit by while you ruin everything we've built. What are you doing to this company? You're going against everything we've established. Don't tell us you've been swept up in this farce about compassion and justice." An older man's voice rang out, dripping with sarcasm and defiance. Robert didn't reply immediately. He stood there, striving to stay calm, but inside he couldn't deny that this confrontation had reached an unavoidable peak. He knew these men would never grasp what he was trying to achieve, and that realization could shatter everything he had. "We can't keep working with someone like you." Another man spoke, his anger unmasked. "You're tarnishing your own reputation and the company's. You built this empire, and now you want to destroy it over some poor kid who doesn't even deserve your attention." Anger began to rise within Robert. He took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. Their words didn't just target him. They struck at the values he had come to recognize over time. Kindness, fairness, compassion. The things he had begun to cherish were now mocked, dismissed as a farce in their eyes. And then he understood it wasn't just this company, but the entire society he had once been part of, standing against him, opposing everything he had chosen. "Perhaps you don't understand. I'm not destroying this company," Robert began, his voice steady yet resolute. "I'm trying to make it better. I've lived too long in a world where power and money were everything. But I've realized that if we only chase those things, we'll never see what truly matters in life." A silence blanketed the room. Cold eyes fixed on Robert, but no one dared speak. He pressed on, his voice now stronger and clearer than ever. "I can't live a life focused only on myself. I've seen how this society treats people like Jacob, the poor and powerless. And I can't just sit back. I can't keep being part of a system that exists only to serve personal gain, while people like Jacob, people with nothing but their lives, are disregarded and pushed out." The room remained silent. No one responding. Robert knew he had made an irreversible choice. He had changed, and that made him unacceptable to those around him. The investors and major partners cared only for numbers, power, and profit. They couldn't see that life held more value than that, or that not every change spelled failure. Mr. Hayes, the older man's voice broke through again, now laced with challenge. If you keep this up, we'll end our partnership with you. You'll lose everything you've got. Are you sure this is what you want? Robert looked at them, and in that brief moment, he knew he had reached a point of no return. These men would never understand the worth he had found in himself and in people like Jacob. He couldn't keep living for numbers or meaningless gains. He couldn't side with those who would never change. Yes, Robert said, his voice firm and unwavering. I can't go on like this. If you won't accept me, I'll stand up and follow the path I believe is right. I won't trade my self-respect and values to hold on to these things. I don't need them anymore. He turned and walked out of the meeting room without looking back. The murmurs and disapproving glances from the partners and investors couldn't sway him. He had made his choice, and within him, everything was clear. This confrontation wasn't just a battle with those he had once worked alongside. It was an inner war to reclaim himself, to live by the values he believed in. As Robert stepped out of the building, the glaring lights, congratulations, and admiration gone, he felt lighter than ever. He knew he had made a momentous decision, and no matter how tough the road ahead might be, he would never turn back. He had found peace within himself, and that was the truest victory. Robert Hayes' life had become unrecognizable since the day he chose to step away from the path society had laid out for him. Months of relentless struggle between reason and heart, between wealth and compassion, had ultimately led him to a profound understanding of life's essence. But like any story, this journey couldn't end with a single, simple change. In truth, his transformation was part of a long, unpredictable process, one where he faced challenges from the outside world and within himself. On a tranquil afternoon, as the setting sun cast streaks of orange and gold across the city's sky, Robert stood at his office window, as if gazing back over his entire life. The city surrounding him, with its towering skyscrapers and twinkling lights, was no longer a symbol of success. He no longer saw it as a destination to reach. Instead, it was part of a larger picture, a world where people like Jacob and Mary, with nothing but resilience and dignity, lived and fought daily for a better life. Yet Robert hadn't stopped. His decision to change his life wasn't a mere choice. He couldn't stand by while people like Jacob were pushed out of society just for their skin color, or let the poor be abandoned in a world brimming with opportunities they couldn't access. Though he no longer sought success through money or power, a part of him still burned to create change. And he knew that to do so, he couldn't settle for small actions. He had to go further. That day, Robert went to see Jacob and Mary again, not just to visit, but to truly transform their lives. He stood before their door, a place still humble and simple, yet filled with immense hope and ceaseless effort. Mary saw him and smiled, asking no questions about why he had come. She already understood. Jacob, her son, said nothing but looked at him with those bright eyes, as if sensing something greater was on the horizon. He didn't need to say it aloud. They all knew. Robert was there not just to change one family's life, but to reshape a piece of his own world. Robert, Mary began, her voice gentle yet confident. Thank you for everything. But we don't need that kind of help. We've lived through tough days and learned to stand on our own. Her words weren't a rejection, but a mark of respect for what Robert had done. Their family had learned to survive with nothing, and they didn't want to burden anyone. Robert fell silent for a moment, then looked into Mary's and Jacob's eyes. That feeling, so different from the emotions he'd once felt facing business dilemmas, revealed something vital. Help wasn't about money or power, but about offering opportunities. He couldn't simply change their lives with a bit of material aid. Instead, he resolved to give them a real chance, a chance for Jacob and others like him to grow. I don't just want to help, I want to create opportunities for you, Robert said with determination. You can learn, you can grow, you can build a better life, not just for yourself, but for your community. You're not just a poor boy from the slum, Jacob. You're someone who can change the world. Jacob looked at him, his eyes a mix of surprise and emotion. He didn't speak, but in that gaze, Robert saw change, agreement. The boy had realized that no matter how hard life got, transformation wouldn't come without resolve and action. And in that moment, Robert understood that his efforts weren't just aid for Jacob. They were a way for him to become better himself. After that meeting, Robert helped Jacob further his education and provided him with career opportunities in his projects. But more crucially, he launched a program to support struggling families, those facing discrimination, and those lacking opportunities in society. He didn't just give Jacob a chance. He created a model to help others, ensuring they wouldn't endure the same hardships. He began sparking changes not only in his own life, but in the lives of thousands. Years later, as Robert looked back on all he had done, he realized that change wasn't a destination, but a journey. Jacob's life had transformed completely. The boy who was once an orphan in a slum had grown into a promising construction engineer. Jacob's mother had been aided to secure steady work, and they no longer worried about life's basics. For Robert, this journey wasn't just about the help he gave Jacob. It was the change within him, a change he couldn't find through power or wealth. He had discovered peace in doing what was right, in helping others without expecting anything in return. And most importantly, he had learned that life wasn't a race for personal success, but a call to live responsibly for the community and the values that truly mattered. The story ends with a poignant image: Robert, Jacob, and Mary standing together in a modest home, no longer marked by poverty or discrimination, but with one thing unchanged: humanity and resilience. This tale doesn't just teach us that change is possible. It reminds us that sometimes, to change the world, we must first change ourselves. The tale of Robert Hayes and Jacob is more than just a story about racial discrimination or the struggle between power and compassion. It is a profound narrative about awakening, about inner transformation, and about how an individual can influence the world around them, even when they possess everything society deems necessary for success. In Robert's journey, the values he once considered irreplaceable, money, power, and personal achievement, faced challenges and reflections from things he had never truly seen. It was Jacob, a black boy living in poverty and confronting racism daily, who gave him a lesson more significant than anything he could have learned from business dealings or financial reports. First, the story shows us that sometimes we live too long under the values imposed by society, forgetting those that truly matter. Robert had spent his life chasing power and wealth, but these pursuits left him spiritually impoverished. He had everything one could dream of: money, fame, and influential connections. Yet, by placing so much worth in these things, he became hollow, disconnected from what was genuinely important. He had overlooked that life isn't just about how much money or power one has. It's also about compassion, sharing, and respecting those around us. Jacob, though just a boy from a poor slum, possessed the values Robert needed to learn. His simplicity, kindness, and resilience were qualities society might dismiss. Yet they formed a solid foundation for human existence and growth. Jacob didn't need wealth or power to live a meaningful life. He lived for simple, sincere things. He did good for others not for personal gain, but because it was right. That was the lesson Robert needed. A key takeaway from his story is that sometimes we must step out of our safe shells to reassess what truly holds meaning. Robert couldn't change the world with money and power alone. He couldn't save society's outcasts by merely upholding the system he'd lived in. He had to change himself, confront his misguided values, and rediscover the right path. Robert learned that real change doesn't start with altering the external world. It begins with shifting how we perceive it. The story also highlights another vital lesson. True freedom comes from no longer relying on material things or fame to feel complete. Robert had lived in a world where success was measured only by financial advancement and authority. But when he realized he could transform others' lives and make a real difference, he understood that freedom isn't about controlling everything. It's about living a meaningful life, responsible to the community and those around us. The greatest lesson Robert gained, and one we can all take from this story, is the importance of compassion and fairness. In a world rife with racism, injustice, and class divides, kindness remains a force that can change everything. Jacob, despite all the challenges he faced, became Robert's inspiration. The values he brought weren't just about helping others in moments of need. They were about resilience, honesty, and unconditional love for those around him. Robert's transformation serves as a reminder that each of us can do something to change the world, even through small acts. He began to act, not just for Jacob, but for himself. He realized life isn't about possession, but about sharing and spreading goodness to others. True change comes from doing what's right, even if it means losing things we once thought were essential. Finally, this story underscores the importance of living true to our human nature. Robert found real freedom and happiness not through successful deals or societal praise, but through doing good, living responsibly, and continually learning from those around him. Change isn't an easy process, but if we're willing to face ourselves and act justly, anyone can create a profound difference. From Robert and Jacob, we learn that in a world full of difficulties and trials, compassion, resilience, and sincerity are indispensable for living better. This isn't just a story of one man's change. It's a reminder that every good deed can lead to transformative shifts in our lives and the lives of those around us.